Hello everyone, welcome to the revision of the culture of the 18th century Britain. In terms of the idea that became so essential to transforming European society during the 18th century, France and England had a surprising relationship. The British had entered the century with a new kind of society, a society that rejected censorship and defeated political tyranny through a balanced constitution that made power distributed among the kings, nobles, and commoners. In fact, the House of Commoners didn't exactly represent the common people. The accumulated wealth of its members was greater than lots of the aristocracy, but it symbolized the people. In France, vague laws impeded anyone who wished to engage in self-employment. The workers and peasants enjoyed privilege that encouraged economic development, and whether in the provinces or among the nobles or by reason of an inherited monopoly owned by an individual or in any company. The moribund French monarchy clung to its absolute power until 1787, when the emptiness of the treasury prompted the king to recall the assemblies of the past. These councils had met for nearly 2 centuries, but they quickly transformed themselves into what came to be known as the National Assembly. This fatal step catapulted the country into revolution, and this was exactly what was needed to break free from the fetters and red tape, the license, the letters of incorporations, and all the old laws which strengthened the aristocracy and bound that mighty giant, France. During the 19th century, the country worked to catch up, and by the First World War it had matched Great Britain in terms of per capita wealth. During the 18th century, the cumulative effect of capitalist practices could clearly be seen, forming a system. Production was organized so as to bring profit rather than merely to ensure the survival of society. Individuals using their own resources are making decisions about how to use those resources without much interference from public authority. The sum of decisions became an economic fact of great importance for price setting. The information that circulates through an informal network of information transmission is in the form of prices, interest rates, or rents influence the choice of other market participants. Politics in the 18th century changed in the history of capitalism by altering European trade patterns. The fierce rivalries between the ruling families led to strained relations between Great Britain and France, and between France on the one hand and Austria and the Netherlands on the other, and between Spain and Great Britain, and between France on the one hand and Russia and Spain, in addition to some Italian states. One of the main consequences of these hostilities was a sharp decline in trade among European countries. Neighbors Great Britain and France turned away from their trade partnership and turned to their overseas positions, but the wars themselves made the increase of revenues an urgent necessity, which made exorbitant customs duties on imports the dominant feature of that time. The constant war between the European powers created a vicious circle. The warring nations needed the riches they derived from Asia and the New World to support their wars. But the fierce rivalry over control of these lucrative trades only fueled the enmity. France and England faced off into five different parts of the world. For cotton and silk in India, for slaves on the west coast of Africa, for sugar plantations in the Caribbean, for alliances with Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley in North America, and for furs in Hudson's Bay region. Because of the central role played by the slave trade in the sugar trade, it was the most competitive part of European wealth on earth. The numbers can shock anyone who understands their importance. From 1501 to 1820, slave traders carried 8.7 million Africans in chains to the Western Hemisphere, and between 1820 and 1888, the final abolition of slavery in Brazil, another 2.3 million Africans were sent there. So a total of 11 million men and women came to New World colonies from Africa. Sugar was one of the first great treasures of capitalism, and its success demonstrated the ability of the profit motive to overcome any cultural barriers to a voracious exploitation. Slavery was an ancient thing. Egyptian slaves built the pyramids, Roman slaves built bridges and aqueducts, but what capitalism added to slavery was sustained and systematic brutality in the manufacture of commodities on an unprecedented scale. It's not only size that distinguishes modern slavery from its ancient predecessor in Greece and in biblical times, but also race. Slavery in the past often had a racial component because slaves were taken as prisoners of war, but war was not always racist. And when the Portuguese brought home captive Africans to work in the uninhabited Lisbon from the 15th century onwards, this trade was not very different from slave trade that the Arabs had carried on for centuries before throughout Central and Eastern Africa. But 100 years later, something new was added to this human trade. Slaves were being integrated into an expanding system of production. Those sent to the Caribbean were assigned to work in groups to plant sugarcane, remove weeds, reap the harvest, crush the cane in the mills that produced molasses and sugar. The volume of trade specifically encouraged war in Africa in order to meet the new demands for slaves. Industrial Revolution. Industrial invention. The end of the transatlantic slavery brings us back to another 18th century chapter in the history of capitalism, the one that takes place in England when technological ingenuity transformed the world of work. There is a joke that only the best graduate students are told that there has no been industrial revolution, it's been only a change, a radical change, as happened before in the case of the agrarian revolution. It's better to use the term industrial development to express the emergence of machines designed to do the huge work rather than men and women. And thus, the expression that we use in talking about the evolution of humans will be the constant work of the laws of nature, repetition, random changes and waste, survival of the fittest. How about scientific revolution? Not every desire can produce a new idea, as the saying goes, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride them. And because we know that a handful of inventors have developed some pretty cool machines, we tend to think that if we can find their motivation, we'll explain why they took this step. But designing machines requires more than strong motivation, and in this case, more than talent. Thomas Savery, Thomas Newcomen, and James Watt went beyond drive and talent and added ingenuity to experiment, drawing on previously unknown knowledge. Thus, technology and science came together and formed a permanent unity. The astronomer Galileo and thinker Francis Bacon lived at the same time. 1632, the Italian Inquisition forced the scientist Galileo to repudiate his belief that the Sun was the central celestial body around which the Earth and other planets revolved. Galileo, with a long and distinguished career as a mathematician and astronomer, had arrived at an accurate conception of the laws of motion and had developed the refractor telescope before it was silenced. Galileo infected another English contemporary with this infection, Francis Bacon. Though a lawyer and judge, he admired Galileo's observations and inductive reasoning. Written to encourage the acquisition of useful knowledge, Bacon said in The Advancement of Knowledge that experiments, not theories, are the anchors of this new science. The finest mathematicians and philosophers throughout Europe were occupied with Galileo's work on the laws of motion, optics, and the use of models. The dominant paradigm in natural philosophy was inherited from Aristotle, who lived 20 years before that era. Aristotle described the world by separating matter from form. Although his work was astonishing in its scope, it described and defined things in nature, not explained them. The behavior of matter differed according to its substance or form, and the four basic elements of air, water, earth, and fire carried properties: dry, wet, cold, and hot. Authority defeated Galileo, but the authority of the church itself. But new authority was slowly being created. It's the authority of the group of philosophers who read each other's writings, simulate each other's experience, and form a consensus of experts. England was far more welcoming than the Vatican to this new style of exploration. The Royal Society, founded in 1662, encouraged and protected experimentation. This association began with a survey of agricultural practices throughout England. Textile. Improving the textile and pottery industries. The 18th century marked the beginning of the era of steam that changed the face of the earth in terms of its atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and surface. 100 years before that time, the world's population had begun to increase, which reached its peak at the end of the 20th century. The insatiable appetite for fossil fuels, caused in part by the growing number of mouths to feed, bodies to clothe, families to shelter, and factories to operate, has long been hidden from view. And if we now look at the ripple effects of thousands of unintended consequences produced by successive technologies of industry, we'll see that these consequences have been enormous. Factories. Workers had long been gathered in pools, shipyards, blast furnaces, mines, paper mills, but with the advent of industrialization, textiles, and ceramics, the factory became a symbol of a new industrial era. The poet William Blake gave these factories a particularly noteworthy name: dark satanic factories. Factories that used water power were spread out in the English countryside, while most of the factories that used steam power were clustered around England's coal deposits in the middle of the country. Factories were dark, dirty, and dangerous places, but for the workers, they were little better than mines. Women and children worked alongside the men in these mines.